Hi, I'm Heather Thompson. Today we will be learning about knitting versus crocheting. Knitting and crocheting are two forms people use to weave a piece of work out of yarn. You can probably say that both are cut from the same cloth. Both these styles are quite similar since they employ close techniques and tools to produce a similar outcome. This is not to say, however, that both styles are without their differences. Crocheting and knitting are heavily different in what type of tools they are required to use to work, as well as techniques and skills. I will take some time now to tell you about these two forms and how these two weaving styles are alike and how they are different. First, we are going to take a look at several ways knitting and crocheting are alike. Each system uses about the same materials to create a subject. Generally speaking, yarn is what people mainly use when either crocheting or knitting. And there are tons of yarn varieties to choose from. The yarn is a good material with which to make something since it is soft and flexible and very durable. Speaking of materials, both knitting and crocheting use needles to craft. One thing I have noticed in my experience with knitting and crocheting is that both types of needles are sized for the job that they do. Smaller needles do smaller things, bigger needles do bigger things, basically. This gives the needles more ability to create variations, but more on that in a moment. As I've said before, knitting and crocheting are both used in crafting of various things. Knitting and crocheting are used primarily in the crafting of clothing and blankets. Of course, both styles have applications of crafting in toys as well. I have pointed out that knitting and crocheting both employ a way to create variations through patterns by weaving. Linda S. in her YouTube video says, "What is the difference between knitting and crocheting?" Oops. Okay, she did not say that. Okay, in the video, what is the difference between knitting and crocheting, says that you can use both of these styles to manipulate patterns. I have also noticed that theoretically, the same patterns used in knitting can be used in crocheting. Another aspect of knitting and crocheting that I noticed is that both have abbreviations for the types of stitching patterns that they create. On spruce.com, Amy Sullivan says in her article, "Understanding the difference between knitting and crocheting, that a similar level of skills is required." Amy says that the primary skill needed is good hand-eye coordination. She also says that another must-have, of course, is patience. Now that I have explained the similarities between crocheting and knitting, I will now tell you how these two things differ. Though knitting and crocheting have their similarities, it is also especially easy to point out their many differences. The needles used are a major difference within both styles. Knitting needles come to a point, whereas crochet needles have hooked tip. Linda S. tells us that knitting uses 2 needles, and while crocheting usually uses 1. There are also circular needles for knitting only. Linda says used if doing circular patterns in knitting. They are used if using circular patterns in knitting. These techniques employed when knitting and crocheting are also dissimilar. I have noticed that when knitting, you have a set number of knots which are limited by the length of what the knots are looped around. This makes it completely different from crocheting, which allows you to chain yarn continuously. Amy Sullivan also says that there are further knitting techniques using your hands or a machine called a loom. According to Amy, crocheting cannot be performed with a machine, as to the fact that a machine cannot copy our movements. Another aspect of their differences is that both will give you a different shaped product, which I have noticed is based on the size of the loops. Forever Bliss Crochet says in her video, differences between knitting and crocheting, that since knitting makes a thinner fabric, it makes for better crocheting. Makes for better clothing. That's what I meant. Forever Bliss also says that crocheting, which has bigger loops, makes better blankets, toys, and various embellishments. I noticed also that crocheting uses more yarn ultimately than knitting. There are also differences in how efficient each style is for its task. On jjcrochet.com, Janya Graciel, I'm going to try to pronounce that name anymore, says that crocheting takes generally less time than knitting. Janya also states that the style of crochet is easier to learn than knitting. Both styles require a different cost amount when buying materials. One thing I see is that knitting uses less material, therefore it costs less than crocheting. Janya backs us up by saying that crocheting uses about 30% more yarn than knitting. In conclusion, knitting and crocheting both have their fair share of similarities and differences. Both systems are used to craft intricate clothing, fabrics, and other things. However, the method used to achieve this that is in no way the same. Preference dictates which one people are going to use. I believe, of course, that both methods are wonderful and create beautiful things. So whichever one you may decide to use, have fun. Thank y'all for listening.